Hello and good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Client Enrichment Series presentation titled Workplace Design, Lighting and Acoustics. My name is James Fatopoulos, and I'm a Regional Account Manager out of Region 6 in Kansas City. Before we begin, I want to let everyone know that we are recording today's session. We will post archived Client Enrichment Series videos on our YouTube channel where you can access more than 30 past sessions anytime, day or night. There is a link to our YouTube channel at the end of today's slide deck. We would also like to make you aware of the available GSA resources to assist you and your organization navigating through the current pandemic environment and safe return to physical workspaces. At the end of the deck are links to GSA's COVID-19 resources page and Return to Facilities portal website. Both of these are linked directly from the homepage of gsa.gov. Today's presentation will be led by Kevin Kelly. Mr. Kelly has been a registered architect for 40 years. Before coming to GSA, Mr. Kelly worked nationally and internationally for 14 years in the private sector on work ranging from houses to office buildings and internationally as a senior site architect of the new Diplomatic Center for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He helped establish the GSA Design Excellence Program and provided design guidance ranging from 115 child care centers to 10 courthouses and federal office buildings through DC. Since 2005, he has been key to the government's drive to better align real estate footprint with its 21st century mission, including being a member of PBS's current Workplace 2030 team, emphasizing the ability of design to increase quality and cost effectiveness if engaged at the right time. He has spoken at the Healthy Workplace Conference, at the Haas School of Business, and has lectured at USC Berkeley School of Architecture on workplace issues several times. He has been a design critic at Catholic University and consulted on the new city of Santa Monica City Hall's workplace. He has contributed full chapters and articles to the national and international publications. His educational background includes a Bachelor of Science in Architecture, Catholic University of America Master of Architecture, Virginia Polytechnic. I do have a couple of housekeeping instructions. Live captioning is available for this session. We'll paste a link for it in the chat, and you can use the link to operate a separate window to view the captions for side-by-side viewing with your Zoom window. We have automatically muted your audio to help us control the sound quality of the presentation. If you are new to using Zoom, welcome. We have found that the Zoom for Government platform be pretty intuitive and user-friendly. You can customize your view with the different pods as you see fit. Speaking of, if you see there is a chat pod as well as a Q&A pod. For this session, please use the chat pod for any administrative questions you have or to report any issues you are experiencing, and one of our CES team members can assist you. Please do not use the raise hand function to ask a question during today's presentation. We want to keep all the dialogue in the Q&A pod. Any questions that we are unable to get to today will be noted and answered and posted on our website at www.gsa.gov/CES. And for that, I will be turning this over to Kevin Kelly. Take it away.
Thanks, James. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. Yeah, there's a picture of me. And, you know, as I was listening to my bio, makes me feel rather old, but I remember very well when I decided to come to the US government from the private sector. And I went in for my interview, and I was struck immediately by the lighting, the darkness, the very drab colors. And I went home, and that night I had a nightmare, and I just saw myself in this place, and I said, I just don't think I can do it. And I was all ready to call them the next morning. And I really needed the job because it was a bad job market in the architecture film. I would have, world, I would have had to move to LA and all sorts of stuff. I'm glad I finally talked myself out of that. but it sort of made me dedicated to the proposition that a government workplace can and should improve. And how many people do we lose? How many people decide to call in and say, thank you very much, but I really can't do that? I know in my own household, my wife was a very good consultant on technology to the State Department and to others. And she finally she just couldn't take the windowless, awful, poorly lit, dreadful acoustic workplace that she was working in any longer. And she didn't need to do it any longer. So there's a really good resource that the government lost due to inadequate, unprofessional workplace. And it's very hard to measure that. But I know in my own family, it's a big issue. So I want to talk about how we can pluck this low-hanging fruit of light and acoustics, which to me are just as every bit as important as the layout of the office. You know, we are so fixated on layouts and what things look like on a piece of paper, but the workplace is three-dimensional and it's also experiential. And to be three-dimensional, it needs light. And to be experiential, it needs acoustics. These fruit that I'm talking about, having excellent lighting and acoustics, are really unbelievably inexpensive compared to the benefit that they provide. But they're only inexpensive if they're plucked at the beginning of the design process. It's very hard to correct bad acoustics and bad lighting after the space is built out. And I'm not going to try to make you all into electrical or lighting designers or acousticians. I am, I'm not either of those things either. I'm playing it on TV. But I'm aware of what the questions we need to ask to get the right outcome are. I was laughing with Andrea. I used to live in Washington, D.C. I live in California now. And there used to be a clothing manufacturer called Sims Warehouse in DC, and there was a ad that always talked about an educated consumer is our best customer. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to be our best customer. Unfortunately, I've got this thing in the background that's driving me nuts. So what I'm saying is that this is very, very difficult to do afterwards, but it's very cheap to do in the beginning. The point is that you, the customer, have every right and every duty to ask your project manager and to require, in the scope of work and from your designers, that they put in these items which are necessary to provide a workplace that is of good value to the taxpayer and which will allow the government worker to work at their full capacity. I love this quote we'll start first with light. I love this quote from Thomas Jefferson: "Light is my almighty physician." And, he wrote that, 200 and some years ago. And yet, we're just finding out how right he was, that there is actually a very, very strong connection between health and light. So I was talking to you about getting things right in the beginning. This is credited from the Construction Industry Institute. And basically what it's showing is that flexibility and low cost implications are at the pre-design stage and at the concept stage. And as time goes by in any project, the flexibility goes away and the cost increases. I wish clients would take this to heart and realize that making decisions in the beginning, and for project managers to allot enough time in the beginning to make sure these questions are dealt with, you will have far fewer, and we know this from our own research, you will have far fewer change orders and things of that nature if you deal with these things in the beginning of the process. The total, the workplace strategic, the Center for Workplace Strategy, is really what we've been doing is taking the 3 items that we know bother people about the workplace the most. And this comes from the Center for the Workplace, the Built Environment from the University of California in Berkeley. And we have addressed all of them. We have addressed, first of all, with sound matters, because we saw that 71% of the complaints about workspace have to do with noise and lack of verbal privacy. The next one was air quality, and we are dealing with that. I'm not going to talk about it in this session, but we have a total workplace scorecard, and a lot of that has to do with assessing the HVAC of the building and of the workplace. Finally, it's in draft right now, but light matters. And it's been in draft for a long time because light is such a complex issue, far more complex than sound. And sound is complex enough. So what we're working on this, we are definitely nearing an end. Part of our problem is that we have so much incredibly good information from our consultants, particularly Arup engineers. Those of you who know engineering certainly know Arup. They did a great job on doing a lot of the visuals and the charts and stuff for this. But in the meantime, what we're doing is we are giving sort of fact sheets, if you will, for each of these matters. So starting with sound matters on the right, we have a sheet on page 11 of that publication that basically tells you 10 steps that if you do, whether you're in an open workplace or if you're in an enclosed workplace, you're going to have a comfortable work environment. And what you need to do is just make sure that those are included in your scope of work to your designer. Make them responsible for making sure that at least the acoustic treatment and mitigation part, which is part of their scope, is done by them. There is a great tool on the SF tool, which has the scorecard. The scorecard training you see there, that is an internal GSA. The sftool.gov/TWS is public. The scorecard training is an internal GSA function, but I'm sure we can get some sort of training on that if you needed to fill out that scorecard. Finally, following the success of Sound Matters in terms of assigning these specific blocks or specific activities that will increase the excellence of what you get in terms of sound, we did the same thing with light. And we have these categories that you see on the left, bottom left. And what we're going to be doing in January, February is to put that out as a hyperlink tool so that you can go to any of these topics, which really are all about what makes a lighting environment excellent. And you'll be able to hit on a hyperlink. For instance, I'll hit on this minimize glare. And this is the first sheet, which gives you very practical, and a lot of this stuff is visual, which I like. People don't read nearly as much as they used to. Things like this is how workplace matters, and light matters is kind of set up as visuals. So there'll be a whole section on how to minimize glare, which is a big problem in the workplace. I'll go quickly through why it's particularly important right now. For one thing, before COVID, the Gensler Workplace Research did this survey, and they found that the experience, the excellence of the experience of government workers, the quality of it was far less than almost every other category studied. And at the same time, it's interesting to look at the workplace effectiveness of each of these different items corresponds very well with how the workers experience the workplace, which goes back to reinforce the proposition that's been proven over and over again, that people who like their workplace tend to like their job much more than people who don't, and are much more engaged with the mission than people who do not like their workplace. So that's very important, and it's particularly important when we consider that now that we've worked at home for 2 years, we've got to compete with the home office environment. And that means when people go back into the office, those who have to go in full-time, those who only have to go part of the time, health and wellness will really be a priority. And I point that out because I think in the past, things like acoustics and lighting and some of the things I'll point out in this presentation were considered amenities. I'm telling you that they are no longer amenities. They are necessary for the workplace facility to be able to compete with the home office, to motivate people to go in to a place where they will primarily collaborate in a hybrid environment. That place has to be, it has to be acceptable, it has to be professional, and it actually has to be attractive. And we know that lighting, it's been proven over and over again that lighting matters to the mental and physical health and performance of your workers. And I'll go into that in a second to show you just why that is. Workers are far more effective with better lighting. For one thing, they've probably had a much better night's sleep than people who don't have windows. Do you know, and I'll point this out later in the presentation, on average, people who work in a space with windows in them get 46 minutes more sleep per night than those people who do not have access to a window. And that's because of what we're finding out about, we call them circadian rhythms, the way that light and the color of light as it changes through the day actually activates our internal systems. So now we're going to do a bit of a poll. James, you want to take this away? This is audience participation.
Yep, we're going to pull those polls into view and we'll start answering them. So the first poll question we have, what part of the country do you live in? North, south, east, west? So we'll see where folks hail from today. And it looks like we have a runaway winner, East Coast.
East Coast.
And if,
okay.
Yep, the East Coast. So, and if for some reason you're unable to see the polling questions, because sometimes it just kind of depends if you've downloaded the app from Zoom or just using your browser, you can also chat your answer in the chat pod.
Okay, so
yep, East Coast.
East Coast. And why do I care? Why is that important? Well, one of the things is that the lighting in different parts of the country is very different. One of the reasons we moved to California, other than my wife is an only child and she has a mother out here, etc. But she suffered very much from SADS, which is seasonal affective disorder. In other words, in the wintertime, she would become very depressed because of the lack of light. And it got to the point where we even bought one of those lighting apparatus, which gives you a full spectrum of sunlight, and it did help. And many of you are maybe going through that as we speak. I'm in the West. Yesterday was an extremely gloomy day, and I was really in a very depressed mood, frankly. Today, it's totally sunshiny and gorgeous, not a cloud in the sky, and I feel much better, much, much better than I did yesterday. If you live in the North in the wintertime, you may experience this. And what it does, does a provider of workplace care about that? Well, it affects not only your mood, it can affect your health. You can be eating more as a result of this, and it can also affect your work performance. So again, and then if you combine that with the way many of our offices are set up, that you don't even have access to the light. I remember my first job was in the National Press Club downtown Washington, and there were no windows in it. And I felt every day like I had lost a day of my life. I went in the winter, it was dark. I came out at night and it was dark. Let's go to poll question number 2.
All right. The next question is, what level of impact would you say lighting has on your mood or outlook? No impact at all, slight impact, moderate impact, substantial impact. I'm having a flashback to my childhood when my dad would turn off the lights all the time in our house. No matter where you were, they were on too long, he's turning them off.
That is so funny, James, because with the story I always tell is one of the reasons I'm interested in lighting was my mother was an actress, and she was very melodramatic, and she kind of talked in that 1940s movie star kind of way. She was terribly dramatic. And when my father was a farm boy from Minnesota, he'd come in a room and turn the light on, because that's what you do when there's a light switch, you turn the light on. And my mother would go into kind of a Betty Davis thing and go, "Oh, please, Hal, not the overhead lights." So we learned very early, it wasn't so terrible to have the light on, but my God, you can't have the overhead lights on. And one of the reasons for that is overhead lighting is very, very unflattering to people. And if you look at the way we light offices, it's almost all overhead lighting. So yeah, substantial impact. And that moderate to substantial impact is very much in the ballpark. Okay, do you want to do the next one now? Okay. This is very important. How would you describe your experience with lighting?
So it looks like these questions are involving pre-COVID, post-COVID. So yeah, the answers are my current workspace lighting is superior to my pre-COVID workspace. My current workspace lighting is about the same. My current workplace lighting is inferior. And then we have, I experienced no change.
It's about the same. Superior. I'm interested in the inferior point of view. Let me just say a few words about that, why your lighting may be inferior. You may have had more quantity of light in the workplace. And I'm wondering, it's amazing to me how many people, even at home, don't use a task light. First of all, I'm amazed at how many government workspaces don't use a task light because it actually saves energy in the long run. If you can dim the overhead of the ambient lighting, we used to require 50-foot candles of lighting throughout the space, which was insane. It made it like an operating room everywhere. We now are getting down to most agencies have accepted that 30-foot candles is fine for ambient lighting. As a matter of fact, it's preferable, and it also saves a lot of energy. But I'm wondering if some of the people who have inferior lighting don't have a task light. And if this sounds like so common sense, but I've seen so many people don't do it. If you're right-handed, your light should be on your left side. The reason is you don't want the shadow of coming across your work. So if you're experiencing inferior light at home, think about that. Can you perhaps find a task light to bring to your workspace? Okay, and is there? Let's see. I think there's.
I think we got a couple more questions after this.
Okay.
So which of these lighting characteristics do you experience in pre-COVID workspace? Check all that apply. There was a window I could see out while seated at my desk. There was a window within 20 feet of my desk. I experienced glare issues from natural electrical lighting I could not control. I had no window to see out from my desk, and there was no window within 20 feet of my desk. And then we have a part two of this question. Which of these lighting characteristics do you experience in your current workspace? So there's a window. There's a window I can see out from my desk. There's a window within 20 feet of my desk, and so on and so forth. So answer both of these questions, and it looks like folks are.
I find these poll questions so interesting.
I definitely have my desk pointed towards the windows. So sometimes when it's really bright outside, it'll wash my face out on camera. So I have to pull down the blind. It gets a little too bright in my room.
Well, that's an interesting point, James, because they usually say that the optimal position for your monitor and desktop is 90 degrees to the window so that your eyes don't have to compete with the bright light out the window and the screen. That can create glare unless your window is pointed north, where you will not usually get the kind of intense light that you will in other elevations. I'm surprised there were 50% of people could see out the window. So pretty good. But 20% of people had no window that they could see out of, and 10% said there was no window within 20 feet of my desk. So certainly a lot of room for improvement there. And the other thing is that we often find that the reason you can't see the window is because there's an office in the way, or there's a conference room in the way. That's a matter of design. That can be corrected through design, and for the past 15 years, that's what we've been advocating. To move offices and things like that inboard, add full light glass to those offices so that they are not deprived of light either, but so that the maximum number of people in the office are exposed to light and to view. Did we get for the other question?
Well, I think we're going to bring up the last poll. We'll close those results out. The reason why I'm pointing towards the window, sometimes I get kind of nosy. I want to see what my neighbors are doing. So,
Okay. There was no window then. Okay. So, yeah, a lot of room for improvement in access to light and to view. And even though the people who are dissatisfied with lighting, it's the least of the dissatisfaction at 9%. I often feel that if people realized how much better light could be, that they would be much more dissatisfied with the lighting that they have. So I talked about what a lot of people have at home. We're asking people to go from a place where a lot of people have access to light and view. It's very comfortable. You can see nature, you can see the passage of the day, and but not everybody has that. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I read somewhere where something like 40% of people who are working at home did not have a room of their own to work in. They had to share it with other activities, whether that be children, another spouse that's working, etc. And so it becomes sort of an equity issue when some of us can work in this kind of environment and others are asked to return to this kind of environment. And it may prove a real morale shock. I think, we all, when we joined the government, we sort of expected this is what it would look like. It's sort of like when I worked in the private sector, everybody in the office except me and about 3 other people didn't smoke. And you just sort of said, well, if I want a job, I have to put up with the smoking. Now, nobody would be expected to put up with people smoking in the office while you're trying to work. So it becomes a perception problem when all of a sudden you see things with new eyes, having worked at home, and then you go back into a place which in so many ways is far below what you experienced at home. And let me tell you, in my opinion, why that is. This is a typical, granted, old school workplace. A lot of you may be in Washington, D.C. A lot of the offices in Washington, D.C. particularly have been improved. But I have been in 49 of the 50 states, a lot of that in my role at GSA. And I've seen a lot of offices that still look like this. And so what's wrong with this picture? So the first thing that's wrong with this picture is that the ceiling plan and the floor plan have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And I can't tell you how many times I'm asked to review drawings and they don't even have a ceiling plan. And I say, where's the ceiling plan? Oh, well, the ceiling plan, it's just that Swiss cheese looking thing with a bunch of 2x4 squares on it. No, people, that is not a good ceiling plan. The ceiling plan has to relate to what's below it. And so this misalignment causes very dim workspaces, work surfaces. Do you know, I used to take, when I was out doing workplace engagements, I would take a light meter with me. Typically, I could measure light measurements as low as 14 foot candles on a work surface. And somebody my age particularly really needs to have 50-foot candles in order to see well at the desk surface. That does not mean I need to have 50-foot candles everywhere, but on the surface, I need 50-foot candles. And when you're sitting at this kind of workstation and you talk to a colleague, you're looking up into the light fixture. This one is the worst kind of all. It's a parabolic mylar, which is extremely glaring. And when they were designed, the whole idea was that it would be right directly over your computer. And How often does that happen? It almost never. And then, so what it does is it casts shadows on your work surface. The other thing is there's no circadian stimulation. There's no view of the outside. There's no, you have no idea what time of day it is. Very, very bad for your health because it affects the sort of your body clock, and very bad for your morale. Then there's the whole issue of color. This very, very drab color. Once I was doing a workplace engagement and I was showing people what things could look like, and there was a little bit of color. It was just an accent wall. Somebody raised their hand and said, "Oh, we can't do that. We're from the government. You can't have any color in the government." Somehow people, we've got to get over that mindset that we don't deserve things like a coat of paint. What is that all about? It's a very good value for the taxpayer if the people who are working in offices are stimulated and feel invigorated. And it's a very poor investment to put people in these milk of magnesia oatmeal environments that do nothing to stimulate them. I'm also, since I'm on this slide, I'm going to give you an acoustic thing or two here too. Point noise reduction coefficient causes sound to migrate. I can tell by looking at this ceiling that it's a real old ceiling, and it's probably only absorbing 70 or maybe even less of the sound that hits it. For a space like this, particularly where I can't see who's sitting next to me and I tend to talk louder, I want to have NRC of at least 80, 85. And if I can afford it, and it's not that much more, I want to have 90, 95. I do not want the sound of my voice to ricochet all over the office. And lack of visibility. We all say, well, we want high partitions for privacy. That maybe visual privacy, and I'll get to that later. There is a point to that. But acoustical privacy, when you can't see people in your immediate area, you talk louder, and it makes for a much louder environment. So let's talk about ceiling plans mattering. Up at the top there on the left, you see the good old-fashioned Swiss cheese, computer punch card approach to ceilings. And you see that the ceiling, the light that's being sprayed around up there, first of all, it's mostly wasted. It causes hot spots. You see those little sort of scallops of light. They cause hot spots. They're not lighting anything. Absolutely appalling lighting. And the reason why it's appalling is because the lighting is coming down directly from the ceiling, and there's no other additional kinds of lighting. The light in the natural environment comes from the sky, but it's also reflected off of things. It's reflected off of trees and buildings, and it changes the quality of the light. This kind of lighting does a poor job at everything. It does a poor job at lighting the surface, and the worst thing that it does is it creates glare. When you are sitting down and looking up at that ceiling, or you get up from your desk to walk down that long corridor, you see dark and bright right directly next to each other, which causes tremendous eye fatigue, headaches, et cetera, et cetera. The example on the bottom is Arup's own workspace. You can see that the lighting is actually, there's a relationship between the lighting and the space below it of what it's lighting. You are using, as you see in the diagram at the right, you're using uplight to light the ceiling so that you kill that glare. You don't have the dark next to the light. You are having light at different levels and different layers, much, much more pleasant environment. And then, of course, one of my real hobby horses is the break room. I always say, yes, it is a break room because it's where you might, break an Al-Qaeda operative or something like that. These break rooms that are so abhorrent to be in, and people are never in them, by the way, that I've ever seen when I visit sites. I mean, really, this is insulting. To think that this is where you're going to give people a break. There are some examples of good break rooms. The one at the bottom is in Chicago. And just adding some color that relates to the act of eating. Red increases your appetite. The one up at the top shows your ability to look out the window. And it's not this sort of elementary school little thing with these round tables and chairs. Think about where break rooms go. Use them as an opportunity to build the organization rather than to further divide it. So let's talk about lighting, because we forget that the lighting that we have now is so recent. During human evolution over millions of years, we depended upon sunlight and fire. In 1879, we started using incandescent bulbs in office buildings, mainly in Chicago. But they were too dim to really be the only source of light. So the architecture still had to respond to the need to get light into the building. So we still had light wells. We still had what they call the Chicago windows, bay windows that would go out into the street and would maximize the ability to have light. And it made for a wonderful architecture. About 1927, they started using fluorescent tubes, and during World War II, they became the standard. And by 1970, when I started practicing, they were absolutely everywhere in that intense, I think as James Hillman says, now it's noon indoors. It's always noon indoors. I love that. It's so true. And that's so bad for the human body and for the human psyche. However, by 2015, lead fixture efficiency improvements allowed both energy improvements and much higher quality lighting. And speaking of sustainability and saving the cost of lighting, more than 30% of electric power in office buildings typically goes to lighting. I would say that most of it, I don't have a way of, the only way I have of really calculating it is just common sense. That, for instance, in the Uffizi that you see there, by the way, Uffizi in Italian means offices. This was the office building. So I am comparing apples to apples here. This was the office building of the Medici. And obviously that one on the left is the office building of not the Medici. But you see in the Medici example, the office building there, how much light is coming in from that window. Do you know, even on a cloudy day, there's about 10,000 lux of light coming through windows like this. So do I even need electrical lighting that close to a window? So just think about all the light we're wasting by overlighting space, particularly around windows. And due to fluorescent lights, light levels now are 300 to 400 times greater than they were 100 years ago. So we've gotten used to this idea. It's like somebody who puts way too much salt on their food. We've put too much fluorescent lighting on our spaces, and we've gotten used to it. And we think if we get rid of the salt of some of that lighting, that somehow the sky will fall in. No, people, the human eye can really distinguish things as low as 2-foot candles in a space. So we don't need to overlight places. So how did we get to the idea that we needed just to be able to see what we were doing? That's all we needed in a workplace. Well, in 1722, Anthony van, I'm pretty good at languages, but Anthony van Leeuwenhoek came up, he discovered the rods and cones. I believe he was the same guy who kind of invented eyeglasses. He did a lot of stuff with lenses and stuff. But anyway, van Leeuwenhoek said that he discovered a sort of root, a ganglia between the eyes and the visual cortex, which is actually way the hell at the back of the head. Go figure. But he sort of said, what we need is to activate these rods and cones and we'll be able to see. So you give me enough light so I can see my page, I'm good. However, in 2002, a guy named David Barrison and his colleagues at Brown University discovered a novel receptor in the back of the eyeball, the retina, that actually hooks up to the body, the parts of the brain and the pineal gland and the hypothalamus and all these things that are intimately involved with your body clock. So it's not just what you can see, it's also what your body takes from what you see because of this connection that we've made by David Berenson. So what does that mean? Well, here it means that since 2015, since we can use controls to actually modulate the color of lighting in the tubes themselves, we can, for instance, make a much bluer light at noon. This again is Arab's workplace. And you see those color distributions at the right and the left there of those kind of graphs. You see that different parts of the lighting spectrum are actually being stimulated by the light bulbs themselves. And that communicates back to the human being that their workspace is in sync with the natural workspace outside. These controls right now are pretty expensive. I remember when I first started working on Workplace 15 years ago, how expensive LED light bulbs were for home use. I mean, they were astronomical. And now they don't, at least in California, they don't even sell incandescent light bulbs. When you go to the store, you buy an LED light bulb. They're relatively inexpensive. They're really inexpensive when you consider how much longer they last. So one of the people who will be speaking at one of our talks that we're giving in the Center for Workplace Strategy, Nancy Clanton, I talked to her about this whole idea of it being very expensive to have controls. And she said what she recommends is that you can have sort of dual control so that you don't have to have something as nearly as sophisticated, but you can have something that turns on the orange at the end of the day, et cetera. So these things are evolving. There is nothing in the building industry that is making progress more rapid than lighting. But we can do a lot. When we plan an office building, we can zone work activities. This is an actual project I worked on where, again, it was the old-fashioned thing. All the, the big cheese had all the offices around, and everybody in the middle was in darkness. So they all blocked the light. So what we proposed was that to analyze the way this building was sited. I mean, how often do we ask our AEs to analyze the direction that the building is sited when we do interior work plans? And I'm here to tell you it's every bit as important as when you're designing the building itself. So for instance, what we proposed was that when you got off the elevator, you'd be able to see at the end there towards the light, morning light, good for meetings, good for getting a cup of coffee, stimulate you. Then the open workplace on the south side, if you control the glare, which you can do, has light all day long. The west is always a problem in that the light in the late afternoon in the northern hemisphere can be very, very strong. So you have to be very sensitive to how you're going to design that. I've seen office buildings in the private sector where they actually use sliding screens like shoji for the west side of the building because the light can be so intense. And then on the north side, if you're going to have enclosed offices, or conference rooms, this might be a good place for it to be because the light from the north, it's excellent in quality, but it doesn't project very far. So if you can think about using the orientation of the building as a way of zoning where things can be. Finally, sunlight sells itself, and this is sort of a party favor of this slide for you to take and use to sell the idea that sunlight is really important as we move towards a new humanistic architecture, one that's not based on buildings as objects, not based on real estate deals alone, and one that does not see the building as an object, but rather as a tool for human beings to have a better life. We can also zone electric lighting, though, to support a variation of work tasks, as you can see in this slide. Notice that there are almost no lights on in the place where people are meeting. The lighting is only in the work area. So summing up about lighting, how can we go from this current state of affairs, not of everybody, but of so many people? How can we get to a place we want to be, where we have a much greater appreciation of light's effect on human beings? I particularly like the image in the upper left, where the guy is sitting in a windowless space, but they have painted that wall an intense yellow, and they have lit it from behind that wall in a little cove, so that it's sort of, there's a great quote in Shakespeare, assume a virtue if you have it not. This assumes the virtue of daylight, even though there is no daylight in the place. The one on the bottom, that's by Studios Architecture, one of our contractors. And what I love about that is, again, they have lit the vertical. People, if there's one thing I want to tell you, it is light vertical surfaces. Don't worry so much about light pouring down from above. Light vertical surfaces. For one thing, the light gets in people's eyes so that they are affected in a circadian way, but it's also much more pleasant, and it makes people think that they're actually sort of looking at sunlight. The thing I like about this bottom image is that this looks very expensive, but those are just, for instance, on the floor, those are just carpet tiles that are laid out in a very thoughtful kind of way. These are inexpensive workstations, but the effect is to give a great deal of pride to the people that are working in these spaces. And look at the nice wall washing that you see in the lower right over there. I'm going to get into why I think it's entirely possible for us to do something that looks like what's in the upper right. Color. My God, they used blue. This is the Forest Service in Virginia. they didn't go with the beige everywhere like we would tend to do normally. So let's take a case study. Let's take a 450 Golden Gate, which is in a building I worked in San Francisco. I cannot say I enjoyed it. I fled it as soon as I could. It is a whole city block long. It's a city block wide, and it's a city block long. And it originally had the same thing where everybody was sitting in the dark. All the bigwigs got place. The landed gentry got offices around the perimeter. And so, what if we, as we go back, we may not have the money to do these sorts of things right now. But first of all, we need to have that as the goal, to get to this kind of space for federal workers. But if we don't have the money right away, and of course we don't, we never do, what can we do to hack the spaces that we have? Well, what if we took those perimeter spaces and cleared out the desks and made what Judy Heerwagen, who works with us in GSA, calls a circadian shower. If we had a place all around the building where we could have access to light, simply by clearing out the workstations in that particular zone, 10 feet, 15 feet, whatever. And the reason why this is feasible, particularly now, is as we go to the hybrid workplace, we're probably, I would say almost definitely, not going to need nearly the amount of workstations that we currently have on a floor plate like this. So what if we just cleared them out and we declared that the outside, that the window wall of a building belongs to everybody? And by the way, the image that you see in the lower left, that's RTKL's office in Washington, D.C., an absolutely beautiful space. It is also the quietest workplace I have ever been in. And you would not think of that by looking at this slide. The reason it's so quiet is because that ceiling that you see is NRC 95. It is absorbing 95% of the sound that's hitting it. Also, the fact that people can see each other, they tend to treat each other with much greater respect. The work tables that you see at the window, those belong to everybody. The one in the center there, yeah, sure, the government can't afford those chairs. Those are like $3,000 or $4,000 a piece, I think. But you know what? I don't need a fancy chair. I can get you a chair that looks fine, looks great, and it's on schedule. So we don't need fancy, but we do need good. And I always love the quote that one of my regional workplace executives said, Jean Keene. She quoted Dorothy Draper, who said, "I can give you good design. I can give you bad design. It costs the same." And people, that's something we really need to bring to heart. I can give you good design. I can give you bad design. It costs the same. And one of the things that can lower costs is that when we design space, we design it so that the quantity of space we ask for is really, really what we need and not some idea of what we think we want. That we, because when we ask for too much quantity, we necessarily mean that we don't get the quality because we can't afford it. So in the future, we may be able to add open. Oh, I wanted to show one thing here. Also, what if in the center of this forest of workstations, we actually made sort of a clearing in those forests, and instead of having downlight, we simply had torchère type lights that lit the ceiling and made sort of a recognizable oasis in the middle of this huge forest of workstations. In the future, I think we'll be able to do things like, actually study making atria in buildings, but some of them are very simple. GSA has a lot of business park type of buildings that are 1 or 2 or 3 stories. Solo tubes, fabulous. I like them so much. I have 4 of them in my house. Basically, it's about a third the cost of a regular skylight. What you do is when you're replacing a roof, if you just are cognizant of a flat roof, how can I get light into a building with a flat roof and not too many floors? 2 or 3 I would go for. You can just add these solo tubes, and they come with all of the flashing and all that stuff already built in, and you can bring spaces where you could never bring it before at a very reasonable cost. But you have to think strategically. You have to think in terms of lighting is that important to me that I have to think, how do I get the maximum amount of natural light into people? And I'll give you one more case study. This isn't exactly the picture, but it's very similar. When I first went to the Social Security Administration in Woodlawn, Maryland, it was like 2 million square feet on like 2 floors, maybe 3 floors, but there were no openings. It was just one continuous floor plate, and it went to literally, when they talk about a vanishing point, you could not see the end of this workspace. GSA, maybe, 15, 20 years ago, helped SSA change that to this. This makes a huge difference to the impression and the professionalism of SSA workplace. It's interesting. I just filed for SSA, and I got to tell you, I was amazed how quickly, because I had always heard about how long the processing takes, et cetera. I would say within about 15 minutes, my first Social Security check was in my bank. So, I can't make a direct correlation between putting an atrium in and a better performance, but I just am going to take that on faith that when you raise the bar, you raise the bar. So I don't know. This slide keeps not going away. So anyway, let's switch to acoustics in the time we have left. My acoustics thing is not as long. But we do have some questions. So James, will you take it away?
Sure, Kevin. And I think in essence of time, I think we're going to just keep questions. Well, we're going to keep questions to the end. I know there's some folks that are answering the questions or asking the questions in our chat pod. We'll keep those to the end. And if we have time, we'll address them. But yeah, we've got our poll question here. How would you describe your experience with acoustics in your workspace? My current workspace acoustics are superior, about the same in pre-COVID workplace, inferior to my pre-COVID workspace, and there's no change. And it looks like folks are answering those questions. Okay. And looks like we got a tie here. My current workspace acoustics are superior, or they're about the same pre-COVID.
Okay. And let me give you a little acoustical tip. If you in your current home office, your acoustics aren't good, and by that I usually mean, for instance, my wife's office is directly across a hall from me. Now, they are now beginning to manufacture white noise for your house, so that you can cover the sound, so that I won't be able to understand what my wife is saying, or she won't understand what I'm saying. One quick and easy hack for this is, if you've got a box fan, if you turn the box fan on in this room you're sitting in, if you're being disturbed by noise outside, it will greatly lessen the amount of sound that you're getting that is distracting. You remember earlier in this call when somebody called my phone, and the phone unfortunately is sitting right next to my ear, and it really distracted me. That's what you want to get away from, and a box fan helps drown out that kind of noise. Anyway, there's just a free tip for you.
I'm one of those people that has to sleep with a fan, so I have to have complete silence from the outside, and when I'm asleep, I like to have a fan on. I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there the same way.
Yeah, almost everybody
All right.
has a box fan. Do you want me to continue, or how you want to do this?
Well, we've got one more poll here. And which of these acoustic characteristics do you experience in your pre-COVID workspace? I had a dedicated private office. I had access to space for quiet, concentrative work. I work in an open plan environment where I could concentrate, or I worked in an open office environment where others' conversations, calls were distracting. So we've got that question up. And then we've got a twofer here with number 2. Which of these acoustics or characteristics do you experience in your current space? So to flip-flop from the first one. I have a dedicated room I can concentrate, access to space for quiet, consultative work, open plan environment where I can concentrate, open plan environment where others' conversations, calls are distracting, or I experience no change. So it looks like folks are answering those favorably. So it looks like for the first question here, a lot of folks are working in an open office environment where people are getting distracted with conversations and calls. So that was pre-COVID. And then number 2, now they have a dedicated room to work where they can concentrate in their current workspace.
So that's a huge improvement. That's a huge improvement over, because the people who had a private office are basically in sort of the same condition as they were at home. But look how many people, almost 60% of people were bothered by the noise around them in the open office they were in before. I'm here to tell you that, and the next part of our talk is how that is not a necessary casualty of the open office. Let's see, I'm trying to advance here. Oh, we have more. Well,
I think
I'm going to continue. I'm going to continue with the presentation. Is that what you want to do? Okay.
Yeah, I think that'd be good.
Lighting design and acoustic mitigation, they're beginning to overlap. But right before COVID, there was a lot of very interesting work that was done on light fixtures that are also absorptive of sound. And here are some examples. And you think, oh, that can't work. Well, it actually does, especially in like conference rooms, so that it's just a much more comfortable acoustic environment. That will be even more important as we become hybrid, that you want to have the acoustic environment in the conference room that may be projected to people working at home. You want to have that to be acoustically comfortable. So, yeah. And let me just say one thing about that. Any of you who are architects, who get like architectural record, I have seen a huge uptick since 2012 when GSA came out with Sound Matters, and that really brought home the point that sound is critically important in work environments. There is not an architectural record that I open that it does not talk about, I would say on the minimum 3 to 5 acoustical mitigation ads per issue. So there again, the government, because of its scale, can have a tremendous impact in positively affecting even the private sector. Why acoustics matter to work is there are mental and behavior characteristics. It can increase aggressiveness. I'll tell you, I went to an interesting conference, and this English guy was talking about acoustics in apartments, and that the United States has the lowest level of sound attenuation between apartments of any of the industrialized world. And I remember my own feeling of being in a row house and not being able to go to sleep because the people next to me were so loud. It wasn't really so much that they were so loud, but the architect and the builder had built an insufficient sound attenuation between us two. And if I could have ever strangled somebody or killed somebody, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning when I still couldn't get to sleep. I am convinced that these type of sound problems are really to blame for the lack of civility, or a huge cause of the lack of civility that you see where people are densely populated. And I can't emphasize enough how important I think acoustic mitigation is between not only in offices, but in dwelling units. And they, look at the things that are read. Decreases helping behaviors, and in the workplace, it decreases problem solving. All sorts of problems that come with poor acoustics. It also affects your health. It certainly increased my heart rate at 2 o'clock in the morning when I went outside and saw a bunch of American University students in the next dwelling over from me, having a beer party on the front lawn and in the house, etc. It definitely elevated my blood pressure. Thankfully, I didn't have a heart attack, but I was a lot younger then. Who knows? I may have an ulcer that is forming or continuing to form as we speak, based upon those initial experiences. So sound matters to the rescue. We wrote this book in Center for Workplace Strategy with the help of some great consultants and academics. And I think it's like 47 pages long. And it really, for instance, I have met with Google, people from Google, people from Microsoft use this. It's such a handy dandy guide to making an acoustically comfortable space. And as I said before, on page 11, what we did for those who don't want to read all 47 pages, and there's not a whole lot of reading, it's mostly graphics, is that we give them a menu of 10 steps that they should do for getting a acoustically comfortable environment, some of which are behavioral, some of which are design, particularly zoning, where you put the noisy activity next to the quiet activity. What used to always kill me in office environment before we thought about this is you'd have somebody who was trying to do a spreadsheet sitting next to somebody who was talking to clients all day, constantly on the phone. These two people sitting right next to each other was the same recipe for violence as an apartment building where you have poor sound mitigation between units. Finally, the science of sound, what you can do, and which should definitely be incorporated into your scopes of work, and you should demand that GSA, for instance, if you're doing a lease, you should demand that these are included in your leasing documents. Our leases are there to serve you, not to serve the lessor, and we want to serve the people in your organization that have to be in offices, and therefore we are more than willing to help make sure that this language is incorporated into your construction documents. a lot of people believe in high partitions as somehow making things quieter. And it makes a lot of sense. First of all, look how puffy those partitions are. You think that they're like Bounty, the quicker picker upper of sound, that sound is attracted to those things. Well, that may be at the lower level, but I can tell you the sound is going right over that partition. And it's like a hotel corridor. Back in the day before COVID, I traveled a lot. And it's hard enough to get to sleep in a hotel. But when people talk in a hotel corridor, as they're coming down from the bar, and they're usually very loud, very jovial at 2:00 in the morning, it brings me right back to the days when I lived next to the American University students. You want to throttle them, but you understand that they are speaking that way because they don't see you. And the same thing is happening in the office as happened in hotel corridors. If I can't see you, you don't exist, and I speak as loud as I want to, and I laugh as loud as I want to. And the fact of the matter is that the modern office is sort of like, some parts of it are like a library, and some parts of it are like a bazaar. Some parts are for meetings, some parts are for heads down. Now, I think that the proportion is going to change. That's what we're sort of thinking in the 2030 world. It used to be 70% of the office space was private, heads down kind of work, desks, workstations, offices, and 30% was collaborative and store service areas. That's probably going to change to 50-50 because so much of what can be done at home for heads down work can be done at home just as effectively. We know that now, and at far less cost to the environment and to the people. But that doesn't mean that we won't want to come in to collaborate with people. And so there will be this noisier, more bazaar-like element to the workplace of the future. One of the things we established early on in the Center for Workplace Strategy was what we call different kinds of work styles. Depending upon how long you were at your individual assigned desk, how interactive you are there, or how concentrative. And we basically came up with 6 different types of work patterns. And the reason we came up with these work patterns, as you can see in the floor plan there, is that they are configured differently depending upon what you need. For instance, this area right here, this sort of violet area, that is for the external people who are outside of the office more than 25% of the time. And when they come back in, they are they come right from the elevator to there. They don't go through the workplace and annoy everybody who's doing heads down work. And look at, I can fit 12 people in that much smaller space than the 12 people that I am fitting in this space. So the work that these people are doing, the more desk-bound and concentrative and heads down, takes roughly almost half of what that other kind of work pattern is. Now, here's the thing: as we go to a more hybrid environment, our work patterns are going to change. The basic rationale will remain pretty much the same, but the idea that you're hybrid will obviously increase this complexity. So we're working on that now. We're very close to coming to a pilot situation where we're going to test these ideas out. But as you can see, what I just did there, those are the work patterns. The ones that are at the top, as you see, are interactive externally mobile or interactive, desk-bound interactive, they are noisier. So we put all those noisier functions together on one side of the floor plate, and we put the quieter on the other, and then we use the conference rooms and collaborative areas to sort of separate these two so that there isn't a lot of noise kind of running back between the two. And by the way, if you follow what Sound Matters recommends, you are going to have an acoustically comfortable space. This is a wonderful diagram that that we worked on a lot. This is not an artist's rendering. The red in this shows the amount of sound in a typical commercially built out space. So you see, for instance, that in the conference room, that how much of that sound is bleeding out to people who are sitting here at this bench situation, and they're hearing basically everything that goes on in the conference room. And again, this is typical commercial workplace. Look at how much of the sound is leaking around. If you do what we do recommend in Sound Matters, this is what you will have. You will still have sound, and a bit of sound is actually desirable because you oftentimes overhear things that are applicable to your job. But look how much the sound is kept in its place. The conference room is private. These people are not hearing, and it's all about how this wall between them is constructed. And that's why I say it is so important to get this right in the scope and in the construction drawings. If you don't want this situation, make sure that you ask for a scope of work and contractually, especially in a leasing situation, that you get this, because this is what's necessary for a high quality workplace. 90% of our costs are on staff. So it makes absolutely no sense. And another thing I like to emphasize is that 0.5% of the life cycle cost of a building is design. 0.5%. And yet that 0.5% controls all the decisions that will be made afterwards. Now, I want to wrap up with just a very brief primer of what it takes to get an acoustically comfortable space. And we call it the ABCs of acoustics. A is absorption. We talked a lot about absorptive material. You really want to have, in an open workplace, you want to have the most absorptive ceiling that you can afford. You can get an NRC, noise reduction coefficient, of 70. It's a little bit cheaper than a NRC of 90, but my God, the difference it makes in whether people can actually concentrate in that room. B, barriers. So this has to do with, remember I told you about this, that's where you want the blocking, and you want that blocking constructed well enough so that you don't hear. That's what blocking is. Now, in the new workplace, in the hybrid workplace, my supposition, from what I'm understanding, the emphasis on flexibility may mean that we have fewer of these blocking partitions, which are by far and away the most expensive thing to construct, and they're the thing that is most likely to fail because it's not constructed properly. Remember, STC, sound transmission coefficient, is a laboratory measurement. It is not a measurement in the field. I see so many specifications where they only talk about STC. They don't talk about, which is what really matters, NIC, noise interference class, which is what is the built environment that you're getting. So relying on just, I see so many government things where it just they sort of think, well, if I just put an STC of 55, which is ungodly expensive to do, everything will be fine. No, not necessarily. You really have to have A, B, and I think C is really going to be coming into itself the most. So again, we're talking about ceilings largely here, but we're also talking about walls, particularly at the corners of spaces. And those are, these are different sort of NRC categories. The only time you would sort of go with an NRC of 70 that I would recommend would be in a private office space. And I know that most government offices are built to NRC 70 or maybe 75. Very few of them are built to the higher standard. As we go forward, as we renovate, as we build new buildings, we have got to have better ceilings. And when we lease space, and by the way, this is a great time to bargain on leasing. So ask for the best ceiling that you can afford. And I'm not sure this will work. This is a demonstration of absorption. James, if this doesn't work, just tell me and I'll go to the next thing.
Yeah, I don't think we're hearing the sound on
that. Okay.
One.
All right. Okay, then I will skip it. I'll share it with people, but okay, so basically what it's saying is there are 3 rooms that all have a different acoustic attenuation, and the one that has no acoustic attenuation, you hear immediately the difference. And I've used that video to really sell people on the idea that they need acoustic attenuation. This is blocking. This shows you how transmission, there are so many places where sound can be transmitted through partitions, not only through the ceiling and through the light fixtures and the HVAC ducts, and that's what makes it most likely to fail. But it can also be underneath doors. It can be through electrical sockets if they're not properly insulated and installed according to the proper assembly. So there's a lot of places where this can fail. And one thing I've recommended sometimes, if you have an existing built-out space, for instance, there was one space that had a partition that stopped at the ceiling, which is what most government spaces, because it's so much more expensive to go all the way to the slab above. It stopped at the ceiling. On one side was an auditorium, and on the other side was workspace. And so you can go back in and you can add what's called these acoustic curtains, which will give you, first of all, they're much easier to install than when you've already got something built out. It's much easier to install than to install a new drywall built wall. So that's one possibility. Finally, we get to C. Now, this is obviously a pre-COVID space. We helped out with FEMA in San Juan, Puerto Rico, after the hurricane and whenever it was, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Look at the density of this. The cover noise is really about making background noise, or sometimes people call it white noise, so that you become less involved with the speech of people that are sitting quite close to you. Not only will it help with people farther away, but none of neither blocking nor absorption will necessarily deal with the noise of people that are sitting quite close to you. So a nice rule of thumb I'm going to give you here is STC plus NC equals SPP, which is sound transmission coefficient plus noise coefficient, which is basically white noise, equals speech privacy potential. So if you want, you can do the math. If you want a speech privacy potential of 80, which is considered excellent, and you have a STC of 50, then you need to add 30 decibels of cover sound to basically cancel out the noise that would still be coming through a wall that is STC of 50. And let me tell you how important I think sound masking is. So here is the sound masking system is not on, it's off. And that orange is the sound that's emanating throughout the space. And you notice that there's a lot of darkness right around that orange where a lot of people are sitting together. So people you're sitting close to are really being disturbed. When you have the sound masking on, far, far less noise is being transmitted. What does this mean in terms of cost? So, first of all, masking is so much smaller than the area of distraction without sound masking. So, what does this cost? And these are the things that I tell you, if you do it right in the beginning, it just pays for itself. So, for 1,000 employees who are making $50,000 a year as an average salary, if you spend $1.50 a square foot for good sound masking, and by good sound masking, I mean sound masking that's tunable. And I don't have time to go into that, but so much unlike the first sound masking, which were basically, there was not much variation that you could control. Here you can get it down to half a decibel. $1.50 a square foot of investment, plus overhead multiplier at 3% productivity enhancement. Now think about that, folks. 3%. You're not being annoyed by sound, and you're certainly going to be more than 3% efficient. But let's be very conservative. So, and a return on investment after 10 years equals out to $19 million in savings. It's so hard to sell this stuff because you can't see it, but it's true. If people can concentrate on what they're doing, I think this is going to become much, much more important in a post-COVID facility-based environment. One corollary, and I'm putting there some of the things that you should have, but one of the important corollaries is that you want the partitions high enough that from a seated position, you can't see over them. So if you can understand 20% of someone's conversation when you are looking at them, the ability, when you are looking at them, the ability to see their lips moving increases the amount to nearly 55%. So you're understanding 55% of the conversation. And by the way, being human beings, you can't block that out. They're talking about their foot operation or the divorce. You're going to become involved. It's going to become far more interesting than your work. If you start at 50% of being able to understand 50% of what they're saying, it increases to almost 90%. So we do want a certain level of visual privacy. On the other hand, a lot of people want to extend these partitions way higher than when people stand up, they can see over them. That's not a good idea if it's a solid piece. We have no problem if you really, some people believe that it can help with COVID transmission. Most people don't, but if that's what you believe, that's fine. But make it so that you can see through the glass, okay? So that you know when you might be disturbing somebody. So thank you so much for paying attention for such a long time. Good luck with plucking your low-hanging fruit. Remember, do it at the beginning. Be an educated consumer. Your GSA personnel and your contractors and everybody, they're working to give you a workspace that works in this new post-COVID world, hopefully. With that, I'm finally through. I'm sure there must be questions. I don't know how you want to handle that, James.
Sure, Kevin. And in your previous slide there, that's actually from a federal building in Kansas City that I worked at. And the person that you're seeing there with her back to us is a former workplace specialist that's now working for central office. And her screen there, she's looking at drawings. So that space is actually was in use, and I actually worked in that environment myself, so I know it pretty well. As far as projects go, what are some resources that from the agency side and from the GSA project team side, who can they bring in to generate some ideas or help create some of these lighting acoustics in their work environment, make it more efficient?
A great question. Every region has their, like I guess I can say Jane's name, or I'll just give her first name. Jane, the Region 6 workplace executive. She would be a person to contact in Region 6, and each of the regions have their own workplace executive. I should have included that on my slide, but I think that's something we can send out, who those individuals are. And this is, as you see, is a fairly technical matter. I'm sort of the technical guy on this, but again, I'm trying to disseminate this information as much as possible to GSA staff and to make our consultants aware that this is a very important thing. When I was in Saudi Arabia, one day I had a French contractor, and they had built an American-designed wall. They had built the wrong way, and I kicked the wall down, and which you're allowed to do if they've built it the wrong way. So I had steel-tipped boots, and I kicked the wall down. And I can tell you, they never built another wall incorrectly again. So the point of that is, when contractors and designers know something is important to you and that you're looking, you don't have to check them every single time, but you do have to make clear to them that this is something you absolutely want, need, and will have.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, the questions that we didn't get to, and there are several, we'll work on a Q&A document for everyone on the line, and we'll post that to our website. So don't think that we ignored your questions. We just have a jam-packed presentation today. Kevin, is there any parting words before I close this out?
Parting words is this. We have been through a terrible experience, this COVID thing. I think it's all changed us all a bit. I know I am not nearly as social as I used to be. But if you look back in history, when there's been disasters like this, for instance, the Black Death was a COVID type experience in the 1450s or so. It was followed by a Renaissance. It was followed by a realization that some of the things they used to hold dear were not that important, and that there was a whole new horizon. And I think that we are going to see a renaissance in the workplace. But it's going to be very, very different than it was pre-COVID. It's going to be much more collaborative, and we need these tools to draw people into the office, and when they're at the office, to make them feel that they're every bit as equal as the person who has the nice office at home, and that they can do their best work either at home or in the office. And it will, I think, initially it may feel a little like it did in the past, but as we realize that a lot of people are staying home and can work well from home, we'll realize that the office is best when it's a collaborative space primarily. And that's my parting words. I may be proved wrong, but that's what I feel in my gut.
Well, I've got another decade to go in my government career, so maybe I'll see it.
Yeah, you'll be the Renaissance man. Yeah.
I'll be the Renaissance man.
All right.
All right.
Thank you
thanks,
all.
Kevin. First of all, I'd like to thank Kevin for a great presentation. Also want to thank everyone on the call for hanging in there with us, and we're able to join us today. We will post a formal written responses to the questions and comments you posted in our Q&A panel as a frequently asked questions document for future reference on our website at www.gsa.gov/CES. And speaking of upcoming client enrichment sessions, we will have a great schedule planned for the next few months, and we're still working on that. But our next client enrichment series session is on e-Reader Digest on February 8th. In closing, the goal of the client enrichment series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective management of your real estate and workplace programs. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.